Okay, settle in. I'm going to delve into the story for Final Fantasy VII, so this might take a bit. Final Fantasy VII has one of the strangest, most interesting stories I've ever seen, teeter-tottering breathlessly back and forth between a grounded tale of science terror and corporate power dynamics and abstract ideas of identity, heroism, with concepts of destiny, environmentalism, and your standard vengeance angle thrown in for good measure. It's a story with at least 3 primary villains, multiple heroes, and highly fleshed out characters, most with their own story arcs. It's a massive science fiction epic rich in ideas full of humor, triumph, and sorrow. It's also a not very subtle subversion of your typical adventure tale. Most of what we think of as standard in the fantasy adventure genre was fairly solidified by the time J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit. A person is reluctantly caught up in an adventure wherein they eventually become the hero of the events. When video games saw their revival on home consoles in the 1980s, this trope was so well known and accepted it became the base by which many of these franchises began. This is why their plots frequently revolved around fighting hordes of enemies in order to rescue a princess. Final Fantasy was one of the first games to subvert this concept, having the rescue of the princess be the spark that starts the main storyline, rather than the end goal itself. This subversion of the typical stayed through the series, Cecil in Final Fantasy IV starting the game unwittingly a pawn in the employ of a villain who himself was the pawn of yet another. Final Fantasy VI starts out with the player being involved in the usual village attack, but is shown to be under a kind of mind control. The character of Terra, or Tina, would usually be the kidnapped princess in a more standard fantasy tale. But narrative equality aside, is actually something of the game's main protagonist here. Final Fantasy VII starts out similarly, with the protagonist Cloud Strife being something of your standard fantasy hero. He's capable, cocky, and reluctant to join the so-called cause of the group he finds himself in.
You're doing this for the planet, same as us.
Not interested.
But in fairly short fashion, the game slowly yanks away all these typical fantasy tropes. Cloud is not whisked away on an adventure, but rather takes his fellow characters along in his personal adventure. The villain, President Shinra, teased as a character from Cloud's mysterious past, is murdered off-screen by the game's more obvious villain, Sephiroth. The princess character, Aerith, is also murdered by Sephiroth. Cloud, whom we've come to know as a strong, capable warrior who has alternated between being an actual mercenary and former soldier, but we thought we knew as his past was a complete fabrication. This works to help carry the player into the final showdown as unsure as the narrative has him written. But what does it mean when the protagonist of a story is ultimately left without his own identity? Final Fantasy VII seeks not only to turn the standard fantasy adventure story on its head, but also to turn it inward and back out to the player, the audience. It asks a lot of those playing, and this has led to quite a bit of confusion. Can this sort of subversion be considered a success if half of the audience miss important concepts and major plot points? It probably won't surprise anyone watching this to hear me say yes, I think it works. I think some of the best stories should leave people with questions. Let them go back into the text and figure it out. Reread, rewatch, or replay to better understand. Final Fantasy VII is perhaps so well remembered because of how affecting its story is, and perhaps nothing better represents that aspect than the most famous of plot twists, the death of Aerith Gainsborough. Coming at just about a third of the way through the narrative, this sequence is a stroke of utter brilliance that I don't think has quite yet been replicated in gaming history. After an incredibly weird outburst from Cloud, who'd been worked like a puppet and given away the much sought-after black materia to the game's stated antagonist Sephiroth, Aerith, the flower girl from the slums, and keeper of the white materia, leaves the party to try and head off Sephiroth and summon Holy, a spell to stop the apocalypse-causing spell Sephiroth is sure to cast after his acquisition of said black materia. The crew head off to help Aerith and perhaps stop Sephiroth from getting to her. Eventually, the group finds Aerith alone in the abandoned city of the ancients, praying at an altar. There, Aerith is murdered right before their very eyes. It's difficult, in retrospect, to understand how this moment was so impactful, and indeed, it's maybe impossible to relay just how this moment even worked within the narrative without an understanding of video games as a storytelling medium. But to put it simply, video games were a crude instrument at the time, but they could be effective. There were games early on, like Metroid, that understand how to use imagery and sound to create a sense of atmosphere from what otherwise might have been accidental. And while some games would use a limited control scheme to produce a sense of claustrophobia or empowerment, depending on the game, it was the RPG genre that understood what narrative could do. In the Dragon Quest games, it became clear that interesting scenarios helped gamers maintain an interest in the overall narrative, but the sense of scope was still primitive and fairly traditional. Even in the Zelda games, which maintained a sense of naive wonder to much of the stories, the plots were kept in tune with the traditional hero's journey. Characters could die and it could be dramatic, but they were of standard fare. Death was noble, prophesized, and usually some kind of self-sacrifice. Traditional drama and tragedy. But Final Fantasy VII goes another way. There's just something a bit more awful about Aerith's death that leaves us feeling gut-punched. It starts with the gameplay. Aerith is a healing character, so while maybe not the most powerful fighter, using her in battle is exceptionally helpful because her weaponry has decent materia slots and are easily and quickly obtainable. Her limit breaks are, frankly, overpowered as all hell. As a bright character with a stubbornly sunny disposition, Aerith quickly grows on most players as well, but the game also subtly tries to trick you into going for her. During the first flashback sequence, if Cloud visits his mother, she mentions offhandedly he should find a woman who's older so she'll take care of him. Anyone who had made a glance in the game's manual saw the ages of the characters, with Aerith being older than Cloud. When Ketchi, or Kate Sith depending on how you pronounce it, does his matchmaker prediction, he sees Cloud and Aerith as a couple. Not to mention the whole bodyguard one date thing from the beginning of the game. All of this reinforces a kind of necessity to the character, but also the meta-narrative we have in our heads from knowing about Aerith in the first place. If Sephiroth is the evil force in the game, then Aerith represents the good force. She's even carrying the materia around to prove it. They also do this very clever thing with Ketchi where they kill the character off and then immediately bring him back. And he even says Ketchi number 2. All this is to sort of trick the player into believing there is no death. But then bam, her life is gone in an instant. The camera even follows the materia as it drops into the unknown depths of the underground pond. And we are left without power, without the character, and without the party member we have come to know, care about, and probably depend on as the game, like life, continues on. I think the director Yoshinori Kitase put it best when discussing Aerith's death. Nobody wants to die that way. People die of disease and accident. Death comes suddenly and there is no notion of good or bad. It leaves not a dramatic feeling, but great emptiness. Final Fantasy VII's use of the death of a main character wasn't just some dramatized event, it was a scar that would never fully heal. Now I'm not sure if any other game had presented death in such a fashion before, but in a mainstream game, this was basically unheard of. It exemplifies how Final Fantasy VII uses the video game medium as a new storytelling art form.